Welcome to the channel, everyone. In today's episode, we're going to be looking back at Disney's relationship with Pixar. It's a really fascinating story that involves many prominent business leaders, including Steve Jobs, Roy Disney, Michael Eisner, and George Lucas, just to name a few. We'll then wrap up the video by discussing if it was worth the $7.4 billion that Disney paid to acquire it. This should be a fun video, so let's go ahead and get right into the weeds of things. In the early 1980s, Disney Animation was in a trough and struggling to find success. Animated films were still being hand-drawn, which resulted in long production times. The Black Cauldron had been in production for nearly 10 years, and after a pre-screening, Disney management was skeptical the film would be a success. But editing hand-drawn animation was a painstaking process, as each frame had to be redrawn, making it prohibitive to make any meaningful edits. Roy Disney, who was the nephew of Walt Disney, advocated for investing in computer-generated animation technology. Roy had been exposed to the concept after seeing a demonstration by Lucasfilm's graphics group. Roy, along with Stan Kinsey, who was Disney's chief technologist, believed the technology could propel Disney animation back into its former glory. For $12 million, Lucasfilm was willing to license Disney the technology, but Michael Eisner resisted the idea. Despite his rejection, Roy and Stan kept an open line of communications with the graphics group, which led to an incredible opportunity. Lucasfilm had fallen under financial distress, and George Lucas needed to raise money to shore up its finances. He was willing to sell his nearly 50% ownership of the graphics group to Disney in exchange for $15 million. Seeing as how the price to license the technology was $12 million, the $15 million price tag for a roughly 50% ownership stake seemed like the prime opportunity for Disney to get access to the technology and have an ownership interest in the venture. In potentially one of his biggest blunders of his career, Michael Eisner refused to pay the price. Lucas's stake ultimately ended up being bought by Steve Jobs, and the company was subsequently renamed to Pixar. Eisner eventually relented and allowed Roy to license Pixar's technology, in what was referred to as Disney's CAPS project. The Little Mermaid was the first film to utilize CAPS. While the system was impressive, it was still cost prohibitive to utilize at scale, and only one scene from the entire movie was computer-generated. The first fully computer-generated film was Toy Story, which was part of a movie distribution deal Pixar had signed with Disney. The film was a huge success. Off a budget of $30 million, the film went on to gross $358 million in the global box office, and it paved the way for fully computer-generated animated films. Despite the initial success of Pixar with Toy Story, A Bug's Life, and Monsters Incorporated, the relationship between Disney and Pixar was souring. During a Senate hearing on digital piracy, Michael Eisner made the following statements. "It is hard to negotiate with an industry whose growth, they think, is dependent on pirated content. As a matter of fact, there are computer companies that their ads, full-page ads, and billboards say, 'Rip, mix, burn.' In other words, they can create a theft and distribute it to all their friends if they buy this particular computer." These comments were directed at Apple's iTunes program, and thus took a shot directly at Steve Jobs, who in addition to Pixar was also the chairman of Apple. Jobs had already had mixed feelings towards Eisner, and these remarks cemented their ongoing feud. After Eisner saw a pre-screening of Finding Nemo, he expressed doubts in the film's ability to be a hit, and was seemingly rooting for it to be a box office flop. This perspective ran directly contrary to what was in Disney's best interest, as Disney would receive 50% of the profits from the film after marketing and distribution costs. Finding Nemo ultimately went on to receive 4 Academy Award nominations and rivaled the box office results of Disney's biggest animated hit, The Lion King, with nearly $1 billion in box office revenue. Finding Nemo was the company's 5th film release, and while Pixar had signed a 7-film distribution agreement with Disney, the relationship between the two companies deteriorated to the point where Steve Jobs refused to work with Disney as long as Eisner was at the helm. The relationship meltdown between Pixar and Disney became a sticking point in the ensuing proxy battle, which was being led by Roy Disney. Roy believed Eisner had tainted the Disney board's integrity and was failing to lead the company in the right direction. Disney's animation division had lost much of its creative talent, and the work environment became intolerable to most of the former animators, who fled in masses to work for Pixar underneath Jobs or DreamWorks underneath Katzenberg. When the proxy fight began, it had been nearly a decade since Disney's animation's last commercial success, and Disney Studios had become dependent on Pixar to drive operating profit. However, After the falling out between the two companies, it looked as though Disney Animation was destined for failure and even faced the possibility of being shut down. Roy Disney ultimately came out the victor. While failing to replace any board members, the campaign succeeded in stripping Eisner of the chairman role, after 43% of shareholders withheld their votes from Eisner. This marked the beginning of the end for Eisner at Disney and paved the way for Bob Iger to replace him. Due to this tumultuous transition of power, Iger was under immense pressure to re-establish a relationship with Pixar. So within his first 5 months of being CEO, he had revived the Pixar-Disney relationship and announced Disney's intention to purchase Pixar for $7.4 billion in an all-stock transaction. Upon closing, this catapulted Jobs into Disney's single largest individual shareholder with a roughly 7% ownership stake. In addition to his $5 million purchase price, he had also invested an additional $55 million to keep Pixar afloat. So his $60 million investment in Pixar was now being valued at $3.9 billion. Was Pixar really worth the $7.4 billion that Disney paid? From a qualitative perspective, it's hard to imagine Disney without Pixar. Many of Disney's most beloved characters and desired theme park attractions are sourced from Pixar intellectual property. Pixar has released 19 movies since Disney's acquisition, with some huge commercial successes such as Finding Dory, Incredibles 2, and Toy Story 3 and 4. In typical studio fashion, it's been a rocky road though, with flops mixed in there as well, such as The Good Dinosaur, Onward, Turning Red, and Lightyear. The successes outweigh the failures, but these failures do act as a drag on the overall financial returns of Disney's investment. So from a studio perspective, the returns do not justify the price tag. However, from a parks and experiences perspective, it's a different story. While difficult to measure, the acquisition has undoubtedly brought much needed life into Disney theme parks. You don't have to look hard to see the impact on the parks, such as Remy's Ratatouille Adventure and the various Toy Story lands. It's undeniable that Pixar IP has been a driving force behind the success of Disney parks. The IP has also been a huge success with product licensing, with over $2 billion of annual retail sales being driven exclusively by Pixar licensed products. There's no disputing that Disney's consumer products licensing segment has been greatly enhanced by the acquisition. So, what's the verdict? Was it worth the $7.4 billion? I think the need for Iger to quickly secure public support ultimately gave Jobs the upper hand in the negotiations. And while I don't think the $7.4 billion was an outlandish price to pay, I do think that the price was high, and Iger's need to secure his position as the next Disney CEO weakened his ability to negotiate better terms. All things considered, I don't think it was a great price to pay, but it's undeniably a wonderful company, and I'm thrilled that Disney owns it. That's going to do it for today's episode. If you found it informative, please give the video a like, and let me know your thoughts on the Disney Pixar acquisition in the comments below. That's all for now. Take care.